All right. We've made it. A couple guys already joining us in the chat. Mark McKeever, of course, reliable as always, saying his DC pull list is down to 5 titles from DC starting in April after quitting Future State. Usually he's well over 10 titles and going towards more independent stuff.
So I did my order from DCBS a couple days ago. So, you know what, I'm just going to pull it up just to give you guys an idea, because it's not, you know, here we are harping on DC. It's not just DC. And this is generally a slower time of the year anyway, right? So my order that I placed in December, $207.69. And that's with the DCBS discount. My order that I placed in so that was my order for November for January books. And my order I placed in December for February books, $253.60. So pretty hefty. And part of that's because I ordered the DC Who's Who Omnibus. So that was like $50 by itself there. So, but, you know, right around 200, which is where I am. My order for March, $108.24. Like it just, and what I usually do when I order is I'll go through and I'll throw in my cart anything that I'm interested in. And then I see what the total is and I go back and I invariably take out a few things. I back it down. This time I went in and my order was less than $100. So I went back and I threw in, I was like, I'm going to throw this in and throw that in, which I'm only mildly interested in just because it was so low. So it's not just DC, but a big part of it is like what Mark's saying. My DC titles are just, I'm not buying anything because I don't have any. First of all, there's fewer titles, and I don't have that much faith that the titles that are coming out are going to be any good. So why should I spend the money on it?
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying there, man. I think prior to the announcement of a couple books, my DC pull was looking like it was going down to one book, which is insane because back when Rebirth started, I was buying everything. So the fact that they've whittled me down this much in this amount of time is insane. And even some of the books that I was somewhat optimistic about, we were talking about before we went live, not so much now. So I might be a little bit more prone to dropping them off my pull. But Mark McKeever says he's doing Batman, Titans Academy, Batman, Superman, Nightwing, and Crime Syndicate. Yeah, I myself out of those am picking up Nightwing and maybe Titans Academy. I was definitely going to check it out, but the Tim Sheridan, I think, is the one that is on that and has been on Future State Teen Titans amongst other things, and I have not been impressed by his showing, so I might not be giving that a chance.
I came across a tweet the other day from Sheridan, and he was talking about that Dick Stroke book and how, it's my first comic. And, it's my first comic on stands. I'm so excited, whatever. I'm like, dude, we can tell it's your first comic. And it goes back to something you've been saying, Knight. It's like, it's not the fact that they're pulling in this new talent. It's that they're pulling this new talent who have never written comics before. So, we don't mean to throw everybody under the bus. And certainly when we're doing our Future State Friday episodes, we're just not real happy with the quality of books. And this isn't personal. We never attack anybody personally. And I don't think that anybody's trying to put out bad comics, but when you have an entire group of new talent coming in, and a lot of them have never written comics before, there's a learning curve. It's going to take them time to get their feet under them, and it's tough. It's tough. And I was talking to Philip Kennedy Johnson the other day. The interview will be out for Superman Sunday coming up in a couple of days here. And I asked him about that. I was like, is it just that you don't have enough veterans to show people ropes? And he's like, it's a little bit is cyclical, and comics they always go through these cycles. Sometimes DC is better quality. Sometimes it's Marvel. Sometimes you get these big influxes of talent. Because, look at, and he mentioned specifically kind of the X-Men corner over at Marvel, right? Where Hickman came in and he brought a bunch of new talent in, people that hadn't worked at Marvel before, names like Vita Ayala, Leah Williams, Benjamin Percy, who did a great job over at DC, but he hadn't worked at Marvel. These are people that, Zach Thompson, Lonnie Nadler, if you go back a year prior to their first X-Men work, where were they? Right. So, but at least with them, Marvel brought in people that were from the realm of comics, whereas DC is bringing them in from animation and prose and other things. So it's going to take them a little longer to get their feet under them. And I think that I know for sure Boom was kind of excited about. He said he liked the ideas that Sheridan was bringing. A lot of cool ideas, but it's execution. So at least those are things that you hope can get better. But I'm not paying whatever $3.99 or $4.99 for Titans every month in the hopes it's going to get better. I'll wait until it actually is better.
Yep.
Then I'll spend my money on it.
I'm 100% with you in that mode of thinking. I used to be the type to just give other creators a chance, but after Future State, I've gotten burned on that so many times. So between Tim Sheridan's Teen Titans on Future State, obviously the controversial Jeffrey Thorne on Green Lantern, both of them were highly unimpressive showings, and by unimpressive I mean poor. So it is certainly frustrating, I think, particularly from my perspective, because I look at where they're sourcing these creators from, and I'm like, hey, I put it at a pretty okay first issue. I know it's better than that. I know it's better than that showing at bare minimum. So, I imagine I'll probably work cheaper than some guy from animation will anyways. So where are we sourcing? It doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, but Mark, give it a try if you want to give it a try. I'm very sort of skeptical about it. So make that decision what you will.
Yeah, I kind of feel like these are books I can find in a dollar bin later on.
100%. Yeah. And really, I wanted to support it because Rafa Sandoval is killer, one of my favorite artists in comics. But these last couple of years, he's just been getting paired with writers that are not doing it. Not writing to the quality of his artistic, not writing to the quality that his art deserves. So it's certainly unfortunate. What's going on, Professor Bill, Comic Book University? Good to see you there, buddy. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just time to get into the main meat of the conversation. You guys have seen the comic source here before, so I don't think there's any need for a lengthy information. We've already spent 7 minutes kind of talking around the conversation, but if you want to go check him out, make sure you go do that using the link in the description below. He's had a couple really great interviews as of late. And if you want to catch yourself up with Future State, you can catch the dulcet tones of DarkKnightNation and our usual partner in crime, Comic Boom, over there for Future State Fridays as well. So, foregone conclusion, but thank you for coming on the show, man, as always.
Yeah, no problem.
So obviously, today we're going to be getting into talking about DC Infinite Frontier. It is quote unquote filled with infinite possibilities in a landscape with infinite multiverses, essentially. And now for me, I do actually want to get into asking you a question here, because I did not subject myself to reading 75% of Dark Knight's Death Metal. And obviously that is the event that is supposedly setting the stage for all of this. Although based on past experiences, I can't help but think they might not have done that superbly well. But Jace, for the people at home and for myself, what happens at the end of Death Metal that sets the stage for where we are now in DC, so that we can sort of get our fingers on the pulse?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to put it, to hear Scott Snyder talk about it, he considered Death Metal as an event to be an anti-crisis. So in the past, and metal is actually, or Death Metal is actually a very meta event, and it's very self-aware in the storyline and the characters of these crises that have happened in the past before, and how they have divided the DC universe into different eras and different times, and this character has been forgotten, or this marriage has been erased, or what have you. They're very self-aware. And so in the end, it's at first the way they tried to defeat the Batman Who Laughs Last, who defeats Perpetua, and he actually gets killed early on in the series, and evolves into this sort of godlike being called the Darkest Knight. He takes on Perpetua. He eventually beats her towards the end of the series, and then it's up to Wonder Woman to stop him, because basically he's going to just destroy all of existence and restart a universe. So he's kind of taking the role of Perpetua, but he's going to restart it as a dark multiverse, and he's going to be, the god of this universe, basically. So what happens is, at first they try to absorb Crisis energy and sort of fight him on equal playing field, and this is kind of Wonder Woman's role and why Snyder considers it a Wonder Woman story, which it's really not. It's still a Batman story. We all know that. But in the end, what Wonder Woman does is she actually, kind of similar to the movie, and it kind of bugs me the way they do this with Wonder Woman constantly. They remove her own agency, and it's always something else that saves the day, whether in the 1984 movie, her appealing to everybody else to wish away their, wish, and it's not really her saving the day. So here it's her absorbing, instead of crisis energy, anti-crisis energy, and she eventually beats, stabs the darkest night or whatever, defeats him. So what's happening is now everything counts, right? With her anti-crisis energy sort of saving the day, you have removed the way they frame it is, think of the DC timeline as like a string or a rope that goes across time, and every time there have been a crisis that has broken that string, they've had to tie a knot in the string in order to keep the universe going. Right. So if you look at the timeline as a straight line or a rope or a string or whatever, it has all these knots in it at various times that are what the crises are, right? To kind of fix what was wrong. So by Wonder Woman winning and saving the day, by using the anti-crisis energy, what she's done is she's undone all those knots. And now you just have this, supposedly smooth timeline of the DC universe, which doesn't really make sense because everything counts, but yet some of these timelines directly contradict each other. So it's just going to be a thing that DC's going to go, I don't think about that don't think about that too much. But that's how they're basically saying, okay, looser continuity. It's an omniverse instead of a multiverse, which, is kind of what they have to say in terms of, okay, well, how can you say that this event happened when it directly contradicts this one? Well, now instead of just having an Earth 1, you've got an omniverse where it's multiple multiverses. So if something doesn't fit on Earth 1A, oh, that did happen on Earth 1, but it happened on Earth 1B, right? So now you can start talking about not only multiple Earths in the multiverse, but then you have multiple multiverses. And that's kind of the way. And at the end, they also mentioned hypertime, which was a concept that Mark Waid came up with in Flash way back when, which sort of a simplified way of saying multiple multiverses and how you can make everything count, saying, well, that happened on this Earth at this time, and it happened over here on this Earth, but at a different time, and everything can kind of make sense as long as you don't, actually make it want to make sense, like scientifically, like in the real world. So yeah, basically it's just a way for them to have their cake and eat it too, and be able to tell story. And in a way, it's like, if you're talking about wanting to lure creators over and say, hey, you don't have to worry about go back and read the continuity, just tell a good story. Like from that perspective, it's great. From the perspective of DC fans who, even more so than Marvel fans, care about tight continuity, that's where you may have some people that say, you know what, I'm not in for this if this story contradicts this story. But from DC's perspective, what they're saying is, now you don't have to worry about it. Just read what you want to read, create whatever continuity you want to create in your head, fit it wherever you want to fit it, and don't worry about it, basically.
Yeah, which is funny because obviously that would, I think in a perfect world, be the draw, that you create an opportunity for creators, perhaps with a lot of clout, to come in and just play in the sandbox and basically create their own space. But that's just not included in the evidence here. You look at the DC Future State lineup again, like, we've had major complaints about how a grand majority of these writers are people you've never heard of, that haven't even worked in the industry at all. I mean, with the exception of a few big names coming from television and film, how many times do you know of somebody coming from another medium, right, that has their first comic book outing in one of the big two, and in a quote unquote sort of status quo setting event? I think it all it does is sort of speak against that. And obviously, like you said, it is DC very much trying to have their cake and eat it too, which is impossible. Aside from the fact that comic book fans, like most sort of spaces in the geekdom, are fickle people. Even if they were hitting their stride, but the fact that they're not actually hitting their stride as of right now doesn't speak very well for them. So, we'll see. And I think the thing that does obviously make me a little bit more nervous for Infinite Frontier is the leader of that show. It's supposedly it is going to be Joshua Williamson steering the ship. And I think that he's shown that when he tries to take a story and blow it up and grandize it, things don't exactly work out well in his favor, with the exception, again, that I'll give him Justice League Suicide Squad. I thought that was a fairly solid crossover, but it's not looking particularly good. And I do kind of want to bring up a comment from Mark McKeever here in the live chat, and he says he misses the excitement that Rebirth generated. Actually brought me back into comics. Infinite Frontier pales in comparison. Everything DC has done since Rebirth has paled in comparison. I totally agree with you, Mark. And what actually does grind my gears is that I was just reading an interview with Joshua Williamson that he gave to Newsarama, and he says this will bridge the gap between Rebirth, Future State, and Infinite Frontier, as if Rebirth hasn't been dead for 3 years. Rebirth died 3 years ago. Rebirth died the moment Heroes in Crisis hit the shelves, the moment Doomsday Clock became inconsequential. DC Rebirth died. So
well, they're supposed to be hearkening back to some of the things that happened in Doomsday Clock. I think they're trying to, because here's the thing, you know, as much as we want to harp on DC, there's been a lot of changes, and the pandemic has been, you know, something that they've had to deal with, that we've all had to deal with. So if you want to kind of cut them a break on anything, you know, in terms of Didio leaving and 5G then getting thrown out, and they've been having to shift things on the fly with fewer and fewer people. So whether, I mean, some of this is self-inflicted, 100% it is, and I get it. But the biggest part of the problem, and I'm not going to point a finger at anybody, the biggest thing that I see that killed Rebirth is how important Doomsday Clock as a story was to that story, and the fact that it took 2 years to come out. Yeah. That's what killed Rebirth in my mind. Because by that time you just couldn't wait, and you just can't wait. If the story is that important, you know, it can't take 2 years to come out. And so I think when Williamson is saying, you know, trying to bridge that gap, they're a little bit going back and trying to recapture the magic of Rebirth. But again, it's not exactly the same, because what Rebirth did is it tried to roll back on New 52, where you separated things. And now Rebirth brought everything back together to the point where I'd say, you know, we're looking at early 2000s DC, which is sort of their golden age in the last, you know, 30 or 40 years that everybody seemed to really love, with the 52 weekly series and things like that, when it was probably the tightest and cleanest continuity that it's been since ever, maybe since before A Crisis on Infinite Earths. So I think they're trying to recapture that, but like we said, they're also saying, but everything counts, because they don't want to discount anything, and they want people to just be able to tell the stories they're going to tell. And also keep in mind that they're rolling in things like the different ways they're going to be distributing things. So I just talked to the editor of Newsarama, actually, Chris Arendt, yesterday, and I specifically asked him the question. You know, I mean, Chris is somebody who, you know, much like myself, knows everybody and talks a lot to these people. A lot of it's off the record, and he doesn't usually like to speculate on things, because, you know, Newsarama is probably the most respected news outlet, and they only write articles that are sourced, and, you know, it's not like bleeding cool, it's rumor and innuendo. But I was like, just speculate for me, Chris. Where do you see the future of DC? And he's talking about, you know, the increase in anthologies, and not even digital first series, because they've done those for a long time, but we're getting like digital only stuff right now. There's no plans to put this stuff in print. I only expect those kind of things to continue. So when you're talking about Infinite Frontier and fewer titles, keep in mind that this is DC wanting to have a bigger global footprint, changing their model, doing more anthologies. There are going to be growing pains, and that's just kind of the reality. The problem is, for all of us who've been DC fans for, you know, 30, 40 years, that change is tough, you know, and not only is it change, but there's going to be bumps in the road where things are not, you know, we're going to get things like Future State where, man, this just isn't very good. So it all depends on your level of commitment as a fan. You know, do you want to step back for a while and say, I'll check in a few months and see if it gets better? Or do you want to kind of hang in there and say, I'm showing my DC pride, I knew it was going to get better. And, you know, you can trumpet your loyalty when you can, you know, when it turns itself around. DC's not going away. We will get good content from DC again at some point. It's just when. That's the biggest question.
Yeah, that's true. I very much get what you're saying too, with the sort of trajectory of anthologies, because I think they've announced like 4 or 5 mini maxi and ongoing anthologies over the last couple months. And frankly, what is interesting is that those books alone doubled what my DC reading list is going to be looking like post Future State. You look at my DC pull in particular, not very many ongoings. And even most of the ongoings that I do have, I have them on there with some level of skepticism. So I'm already sort of primed and ready. And unfortunately, Future State as this sort of stopgap is not doing them any favors, for sure. It does obviously make me concerned for the future of DC Comics because, I mean, while I am in this position now as a comic book reader, where while I'm so ready for change and I'm so ready for something new that I'm willing to actually walk completely outside of the DC bubble and find that something new elsewhere. I was actually just going through my last couple months of polls, and no surprise, half of it is indie. Half of it. I used to buy every DC Rebirth title. At one point, and I know this isn't a Marvel conversation, I was buying all the X books on top of other things. And now half of my pull is indie. So it's going to be a really weird time because you do obviously have that readership of fans that are only Big Two people, only superhero comics people, and they may very well walk away for comics as a whole, or at least for the next couple of years. And obviously where I'm at, not only as a reviewer, but also as a comic book writer, I want to have my finger on the pulse. I will continue to read comics. The only problem is, DC, what happens when all my money is now tied up in indie comics ongoings that are good, right? Or at least trying to do things out of the box and are trying to be creatively inventive. And then you finally make something that I might be interested in. Well, do I have the money to backstep to DC Comics? Will my love of Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, will that save you? Right? Because that's certainly starting to whittle away. And there is something obviously to be said about character loyalty. I know that is a huge thing amongst comic book fans. There are a lot of readers that will read their favorite characters regardless of who is on it, whether or not they like it, and they'll admit to it. Yep. So, that's astoundingly interesting to me. Whereas, I feel like I've kind of grown up in that generation of comic book reader where it's all about the creator. Maybe I'm sure there are people in my class of comic book readers, like this sort of that group of us that are starting to veteranize ourselves, but I don't know. It's a really weird time to be a DC Comics fan. And where I'm wondering here, we're obviously talking about what Infinite Frontier could be. Obviously, we can sort of start to make some speculations based on what we're hearing news-wise, what we're seeing out of DC Future State. And my next question for you is, Jace, they're saying that there will be I think a 12-part Infinite Frontier series that is supposed to transition us into this new age of DC Comics. Do you think that it will properly sort of chaperone us at the end of Future State? Or do you think it's going to be a pretty cold cut and this Infinite Frontier series is just going to hit the ground running with Infinite Frontier, and we're not going to know what happened to Future State and what happened to everything prior?
So I think there's a misconception. Infinite Frontier as a series is only one issue as far as I know. Infinite Frontier 0, one shot. There are 12 different stories in there from various creators. So I think that's where we're talking about with gotcha. the chapters. So, I mean, to kind of, we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about, the state of the universe in terms of story and in-universe kind of situation. And then we're also talking about the nuts and bolts of the comic book industry, specifically as it pertains to DC, which is owned by Warner Brothers, which is in turn owned by AT&T. So I don't think that we can judge the quality of what we're going to get in Infinite Frontier as a publishing initiative, right? So you've got two parts. You've got Infinite Frontier 0, which is the one shot, a specific comic. And then you've got the new trade dress, which is considered the, I don't know, you could call it the Infinite Frontier era or the Infinite Frontier age of DC, where it's indicative of, hey, everything matters. Now we're talking about an omniverse rather than a multiverse. And will that ever change? Yeah, it could get rolled back. It's comics. Anything can happen, right? So let's talk about it in terms of like behind the scenes, nuts and bolts, like what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding. So again, to go back to the 5G thing, Didio has a vision, and it doesn't work out, and he's let go. And I talked to Dan not too long ago, and he even said, it was probably time. It was time, and he had expected to be gone 3 or 4 different times. He thought he had a foot out the door. They were going to fire him, and then eventually it happens, right? So now they've got all these plans, and everything's up in the air. Didio's gone. They're contemplating throwing it out. Pandemic hits. Yep, let's throw it all out. Let's stop paying. Because here's the thing: they're paying creators to put out monthly books. They're also paying creators to work on 5G stuff, right? At the same, so they're paying for this material way ahead of time. They're getting no return on it, and no planned return for months and months, right? At the same time, Liferd's trying to pinch pennies. AT&T is hemorrhaging money. So Didio's gone. Hey, we're going to throw the 5G stuff out. That'll save us money. We're not paying creators to work on that. Then they decide, well, there's already material created that we paid for. Let's use it. Okay, how can we use it? Let's massage it. Let's turn it into a future state. And so they went back to a lot of those same creators that were working on that weren't working on the regular books. That's why in future state you don't see names like Brad Walker or Peter J. Tomasi or Robert Venditti or whatever. They were working on the regular line during the summer while you had these new creators, the Jeffrey Thornes and the Tim Sheridans and what have you, working on the future state stuff. And it wasn't a situation where, hey, whatever I was going to plan on for 5G, I'm going to go ahead and do, because they did look a little bit towards Infinite Frontier. For example, Philip Kennedy Johnson was not doing anything 5G Superman, right? And then he ends up doing the future state Superman, and they tag him to do the Infinite Frontier Superman as well. So there's, again, it's a lot of balls up in the air. They announced the layoffs. They had to give 90 days notice to these people that were going to be leaving. So we're talking really about future state of them trying to make the best of kind of a bad situation, which again, a lot of it's self-inflicted. Let's use as much material that was already created. Let's use those creators that we already had promised work to and have already done work, rather than throwing it all out and now having to pay more money to have new material come in. And think of a future state is far more of a Band-Aid, like the way Convergence was to cover the move, than it is any kind of transitional. I would even say future state is even more of a Band-Aid than it is a repurposement of or repurposing of 5G material. But where they've run into trouble is that when you did Convergence, you had all that created by, again, not creators that weren't on the regular line. Those creators on the regular line continued to do work, and then they just dropped this 2-month Convergence event in, and then the other creators picked right back up. The problem is you had a much larger percentage of editorial staff and support staff leave, right at the middle of December or so, right? So now what you're talking about is this 2 months of future state is editorial saying, okay, what is possible now and what can we plan for the future? Rather than with Convergence, they were already working on what comes after Convergence. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we're seeing this huge reduction in the amount of titles, and we're not seeing names like Brad Walker and Peter J. Tomasi and Robert Venditti and people that we've gotten used to. They're not in the solicits for March. They're not in the solicits for April. And people are thinking, well, what the heck's going on? They're figuring out, they're taking pitches, and, and not all this is happening just right now. It probably started happening a few weeks ago after the first of the year, after the holidays. Okay, now let's start hearing from our veteran creators, Dan Jurgens, those kind of guys. And you may see some stuff from them come, late April, May, June. So it's not to say if you don't see your favorite DC creators that they're gone for good. Supposedly they are still working on things. There's big events coming up. There's a big Superman event coming up. There's other things, but it's not a situation like Convergence where they had that Band-Aid and they kept planning. Their plans were so disrupted between Didio leaving, all the layoffs, and the pandemic, that we're just getting this kind of, for lack of a better term, crappy material right now that's trying to bridge the gap to get us where we want to be. And I think everybody's trying to put their best foot forward with their Infinite Frontier stories when you talk about the Infinite Frontier Zero comic.
Yeah.
And what that's supposed to do is basically, more so than any events that actually happen in the story, it's supposed to capture the tone of, hey, anything is, now it's infinite possibilities. Anything can happen. You can see any kind of story, and sort of where do we go from here? You will see some things because they're so enamored with some of these ideas, like the Magistrate and Titans Academy or whatever, that these are ideas that you see in Future State that are happening way in the future. Okay, now pull it back whatever amount, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They like those ideas, and you're gonna see the beginnings of those ideas. Obviously, in Future State Teen Titans, I'll use that as an example. We see the wreckage of the Academy, and everything that's, we get ominous hints about how things have gone terrible, culminating in Dick Grayson putting on a Deathstroke mask at the end. Okay, well, now when Tim Sheridan starts up his Teen Titans Infinite Frontier era of that book, now we're going to see the establishment of the Titans Academy. Will we ever get to that point where Dickstroke, is a thing again? Probably not. Just like we didn't see the things in Future's End actually come to pass, which is, a problem with these time jumps. It always is. People don't care once they've hit the back issue bins, and they don't matter unless it's something that catches fire and people do care about it, a la Killing Joke or whatever. It gets incorporated. Yeah. So you will see some hints in Infinite Frontier Zero of things that like we're going to see. James Tynion has already said, Magistrate's going to be a thing. We know the mayor of Gotham City, Nakano or whatever his name is, hates, vigilantism and no more masks and that kind of thing. So you'll see some of the ideas, but a lot of it, you won't see it again. I mean, I think the biggest one is the Magistrate thing, just because so many Infinite Frontier or Future State books rather are set in Gotham City. So that's going to be a thing. And I was talking to Manny about this the other day, actually. We're going to look back on this era of comics from about, I'll say 2016, 2017 to probably around 2022. And you're just going to see so many villains that at their core are fascist. And it has so much to do with just reflecting our reality. Look back at the comics from the 40s, right? Who was everybody fighting? The Nazis. It's, and personally for me, man, I'm over seeing fascists as villains in comics, but people that say comics aren't political, and it's not even overt. It's just that this at least in this country, we're talking about Western comics, United States here. As a creator, you can't help but have that come out in your work when that's the reality that you're living in. So yeah, it's just going to be all fascism all the time for a while. Certainly what the Magistrate looks to be, boot on your sort of thing.
Yeah, here's the thing, is that some of these setups I don't hate. It's just that there are so many disparate parts working singularly rather than together. You don't know what's happening. They needed to release a timeline like 2 weeks after this publishing initiative started, just so that we could get things together. And I think that's going to be a huge problem for Infinite Frontier. So what do you do now? You have 40, 50 books in your main line. You're going to make a timeline showing us where all of those take place too? I don't think so. I don't quite see that being consistent throughout the line. And regarding particularly the Magistrate, I think it's a fine setup. It's certainly not it's not the most innovative, landscape to put Gotham in, but it's certainly one that I wouldn't mind reading. And yet, you don't really know how fulfilled this is going to be. While Tynion's Batman's going on, okay, you make this tease as if this is the possible future. Last time we had a possible future, the last 2 times we had a possible future with DC Comics, neither of them came to be, right? We have Future's End, which conveniently, you hear Future's End and Future State, you're like, okay, cool, it doesn't matter. It also probably doesn't help that the inside of all the Future State books specifically cite these as the unwritten stories of the DC universe.
Yeah.
So they will remain to be unwritten. They will remain to be sort of uncemented in the library of DC Comics continuity. Why does it matter? And I'm not saying that I'm certainly not saying that stories that aren't in continuity don't matter, because most of my favorite comic book stories are not in the current DC continuity, or I guess they are now because everything counts. But prior to that, that certainly wasn't necessarily the case. And so I think there's just so much uncertainty left into the air. And it obviously doesn't help that, we have no idea what's happening. A lot of their big name creators are eyeing independent projects. And frankly, those are far more time consuming than anything you do with the big two, especially if that independent project is your baby, because you're there every step of of the process. So you don't really have time to go write, Dick Stroke or, the next Batman or whatever. So it remains to be seen. And what I think is so funny about DC right now, I saw a cool little conversation happening with, everybody in the live chat about page rates, right? Like they're scaling down on some of these books so that they can pay these no-name writers and artists pennies. But what's funny is that it seems like the investments they're actually making in creators has not done them well, right? Supposedly, based on the live chat, and I can neither confirm nor deny, supposedly Bendis is making $1,000 a page for script. Really? Because I don't know many comic book artists that even make $1,000 a page for script, and I mean I unfortunately wouldn't be surprised, but obviously he's not churning out financially or critically successful books for DC, so that's a dud. I can imagine that John Ridley is getting a pretty handsome payment for doing the next Batman, and it's selling well from what I understand. So in DC's eyes, that's a total success, but I do begin to wonder how they're going to scope that out. Is there going to be a massive sort of gradient, right, between our big names and the people you've never actually heard of? What happens to the guys in the middle, right? The bulk of your workforce, like you were mentioning, the Venditti, Tomasi. There are obviously rumblings of Wade that have been going on for months, maybe even the better part of a year with DC. So where does that make us go from there? And I know obviously we can remain somewhat hopeful that these names that we've come to know and love at DC will step onto a project, but what happens when all of DC's marquee books are already taken? Because that very much seems like the case, unless some of those creators are willing to step off of those titles or are planning to step off of those titles. It's just so hard, to get a grip on what's going to happen. And unfortunately, these last 2 years, with Future State being no exception, DC hasn't exactly given me reason to hope for the best.
Yeah. When it comes to Bendis, so he's no longer exclusive at DC. I have my doubts whether his contract was officially up or not. I would think that Dan would have signed him for a longer contract. I think there probably were sales thresholds in there that because that's often part of the exclusive contract. And if you don't meet those sales thresholds, then the publisher has an opt out to say, okay, you're no longer going to be exclusive. So I don't know. I've never asked anybody. Kind of feel like it's none of my business what his actual page rate is. But exclusive contract is so much. There's so much more to it than just what you're paid. Are you paid an average pay rate more than the usual person? Well, sometimes, it just depends on your contract, and it probably depends on, your clout basically in the industry. The big things about exclusive contracts that attract creators, number one, you get benefits. So you're getting health insurance and you may have retirement as well, 401k or what have you. But the other thing is that you're guaranteed a specific number of pages that you're going to script or you're going to draw each month. And even if you're not provided that material because the script comes in late or they don't have a book for you, you're still paid your page rate for that whatever the minimum is, right? So from the perspective of a publisher, if they're paying you anyway, then they better have you on books, right? So that's just sort of the reality of what it is. And so some of these, it may not even be a page rate. It may be you're on, we're going to pay you like a salaried employee. We're going to pay you X amount of dollars a month, and we expect these many pages in return. And so, if you take the amount you're paid, the salary you're paid per month or per week or whatever it is, and you break it down, this is how many pages you're supposed to create, the minimum, then it could very well be $1,000 a month. I don't know. What I do know is that you're not going to see any exclusive contracts at DC. DC is going to try to get out of all of the exclusive contracts they have. There's going to be no new ones signed. They want everybody to be a mercenary, basically. They want everybody to be freelance because at any time, with almost no notice, they can say, all right, you're done. We're going to bring this person on, whatever. We want to go in a different direction. We have a chance to bring, this person on, that person on. what you're going to see with a lot of the middle tier creators that you were talking about is I expect DC. So DC across the board, out of any publisher in comics, paid the highest paid rates for both writers and artists. You're going to see them come back down. That may not. I don't think that they'll come back down to the point where a bunch of people are going to pass them, but they're going to come down to where maybe they're paying the same as Marvel, or only slightly more. So if you're a creator who's been working, like let's take Peter J. Tomasi, right? You've been working at DC for over a decade, and you've been paid a certain rate per script or per page or whatever it is for all this time, and now they say, okay, now we're going to pay you 20% less. Why should you keep working for DC? Right. Why not go and do something different? Whether, you're hearing from, a bunch of people, you've been in the comic industry forever, and they're saying, hey, I'm over here at Image doing, Scott Snyder, I'm over here at Image doing my Nocterra book, and I get 80% of the proceeds from that, as opposed to DC where I'm just paid, whatever. At DC, in order to make the same amount I'm making on a Nocterra issue, I've got to sell 300,000 copies. We're over here at Image, I only have to sell 50,000 and I'm making the same amount. Why wouldn't you? It's a no-brainer. So the thing that where you start to wonder, especially with guys like Mark Waid, whose dream has always been to write Superman. He's never been on the regular Superman or Action Comics title. Mm-hmm. He's a gatekeeper for that, right? I mean, if you want to write Action Comics, you want to write Batman, you want to write Detective Comics, whatever it might be, you have to go and work for DC, and they're going to be up front saying, we're only going to pay you this much. I don't care that your name's Mark Waid or Tim Sheridan or Jeffrey Thorne or what the hell your name is. This is what we pay. Right. And if you want to write the story, this is what it is. Take it or leave it. So that's a part of it as well, right? So a lot of these, it's a little easier for writers because they can go and do, a couple books. They can do a book at Bad Idea. They can do a book at Image. They can do a book at Aftershock and write one DC book. For an artist, it's much, much tougher. You can't juggle those kind of things. So, but DC doesn't tend to do as many exclusives with artists. That's more of a Marvel thing. DC tends to do exclusive with their writers, guys like Tom King. Although Mitch Garrett is an artist who's exclusive over there. So is Clay Mann. But yeah, you got, Scott Snyder, Tom King, Brian Bendis. So you're going to see those go by the wayside. And it would be a long time before I'd expect to see an exclusive creator at DC. Liefeld would have to be gone, I think, in order for that to happen.
Pamela Liefeld, baby. Yeah, I mean, you're already starting to see it. From what I understand, Greg Capullo has already announced that he's going to be doing some covers for Marvel coming up in the very near future. Tony Daniel's been doing covers for Marvel for the last 2 years, I think, just about. So I think you're starting to see that more and more. And there's obviously this incentive for these bigger creators now to take, even like you said, a fraction of their following, make more money. And here's the thing nobody talks about. Say it with me, kids. Intellectual property. They own everything they're creating. They license it for merchandise, for film, for you name it. They could license it for butt plugs if they wanted to, but it's theirs and they own it and they make money on it in perpetuity, which is something that they don't get at DC Comics. Aside from the fact that, from what I understand, things have obviously become a little bit more hostile for people in that spot. And there is this awkward dichotomy where it seems like DC either totally trusts the creator, and unfortunately for modern DC, it's Ben Bendis. They've given Bendis a lot of creative control, or they give you nothing. And you get a lot of these sort of mid-tier writers with talent, with good ideas that probably have the capability to become their next upper echelon, who are being pigeonholed because of the ideas of these big name writers that are enveloping their space, which is unfortunate. And I agree with what Hawkworld's saying here. DC doesn't seem to have confidence in much anything they do. Many fans don't have confidence in them either. And I am beginning to reflect that. One of the things that I've noticed, right, is that for the last 2 years, from actually even teases in the original, actually teases back in the button, DC's been teasing the JSA for like 4 years now. 4 years they've consistently teased the JSA, knowing that fans want it. Apparently, Alan Scott is going to be one of the stars of the new Infinite Frontier, but is that just lip service, or will he actually play a role? It's
that was a Jeff Johns thing, and again, a lot of this goes back to AT&T making the purchase and putting Liefeld in charge. That's why Diane Nelson left. I don't, that's speculation on my part. I've never gotten 100% confirmation on that. It's something that nobody ever wants to talk about, but he leaves and he doesn't, he'll still do something here or there with DC Comics, but he's not a big part of the picture like he was with Rebirth. So, you're not going to see that. You're not going to see those things that were teased. It's just another thing that goes on the pile that fans will want. And until the time is right, and whatever creator they can get. I mean, I'm sure that Jeff Johns, makes top of the page rate whatever DC pays. He probably has no interest in going and writing comics for what they're paying now. So right. That's just a reality. And so you're right. You're going to see a lot of people. So, I mean, it's really changing. The whole dynamic of creators are changing. It used to be this bell curve is the way I looked at it, right? So you start off in independent comics because that's what people tell you. Heck, how do you get in? Get noticed. The big two will always tell you, don't call us, we'll call you. So you want to write comics, you want to create comics, then write comics, create comics. And you start down here, Matthew Rosenberg is a perfect example of this. So you start down here, you make maybe I should say you start over here for people to look at it. And you start your creative comics, and maybe it's self-publishing or whatever, and you start to make a name for yourself, and then you're at Aftershock, then you're at Image, and then you get to the point where you're over here at the top of the mountain, and you're at DC or you're at Marvel, and you're making, comics telling your Captain America story, like Ed Brubaker, the story you've always had, bring Bucky back, whatever. Then you're big enough, you're at the top of the heap, you have enough following, now you don't need them anymore, right? And now you end up back down here on the other side. Now you're back here with your own following, teamed up with Sean Phillips, telling whatever story you want to tell.
Yeah.
Because you don't need them anymore, right? You got it out of your system. You told your one Batman story or your one Captain America story. So you start off as a no-name, and you need the big two more than they need you, right? But you make a big enough name for yourself, you can go and you can tell those stories that you've always planned on telling or always dreamed about telling. You make a following because, as you said yourself earlier tonight, you have people that only read superhero comics. They only read Marvel. They only read DC. You make a name for yourself, and it's always a constant aging of the readership. And as people get older, they tend to, for the most part, they tend to follow more creators than they do characters necessarily or publishers. And then you leave and go do whatever you want, and you own the IP. And if it's the next Walking Dead or the next, Sandman or whatever, you reap those benefits. Well, I mean, you have people like Jimmy Palmiotti who he gets offered stuff at Marvel and DC all the time, but you know what? He'd rather do his own stuff. He doesn't want to work on stuff that he doesn't own at this point. Well, and it's huge. So you're going to see it. We could see the landscape change where people jump over the middle of it. They just make a big enough name for themselves and independent that they just stay there. And they never go up to, tell whatever story they were planning on telling at Marvel or DC.
And to be frank, I think that right now, the current incentive for people with a decent indie following to go to Marvel DC is less about climbing the career ladder and actually more about self-indulgence. Because even like, frankly, I mean, to be real, I've seen no financial success in my single issue of a comic book that I've published. And I think to myself now, the opportunity to work for one of the big two would be fun, and it would be a good learning experience, particularly because I am so green, right? But I look at things down the line and I think to myself, 5-10 years from now, if by the grace of whatever God we pray to, right, I build a career for myself, is my move going to DC or Marvel because I feel like it's going to do me justice, or is it because I have a Batman story kicking around that as a fan that I want to tell? I think it's the latter of the two. And I'm saying that, literally stepping right off the boat of a starting career. So what is that saying for the people that are already building their reputation? What about creators like you mentioned? I mean, Brubaker and Phillips, obviously they spent time with the big two, but you are seeing some creators working for Aftershock, for Image, so on and so forth, that haven't touched a DC comic, or if they haven't touched it in the better part of a decade, and they don't really need to. And I think it speaks volumes, particularly with what Scott Snyder's doing. He's building his own imprint over at Image. He has been DC's golden boy for, I would say, at least 7 years now, right? Like in terms of the overall creative direction of DC Comics. DC's golden boy, who has never said a bad word about what's happening, the goings on of all of these transitions that DC has been going through. He's going to start his own imprint and get hands off with DC Comics. What does that tell you? Right? I mean, obviously he's being a gentleman about it, but what does that tell you? There are situations like that where you need to read in between the lines, I think, because as far as I'm concerned, whether or not I've been enjoying for what Scott's been doing recently at DC, this move means a lot. I think it's very telling, and I think it's very telling as to what's going to come. You know, people have mentioned Jeff Johns' book with Gary Frank, Geiger, going to Image Comics. That's going to blow down the doors. I'll tell you that right now. That book, sales-wise, going to blow down the doors. Jeff Johns and Gary Frank put out this Three Jokers book that everybody's been waiting for years.
That was Fabic, Jason Fabic.
Sorry, that's what I meant to say. But
Clock was Frank and Johns.
But I would even argue that Gary Frank is a bigger artist than Fabic. You know, God forbid if that was Gary Frank and Jeff Johns. I mean, put it this way: Doomsday Clock and Three Jokers, Jeff Johns' last two big projects at DC, both of them got delayed into oblivion. What happened? Both of them became two of DC's most financially and to varying degrees critically successful books in the last decade. So I think it's telling you that there's a big transition towards following creators over characters. And I wonder how DC is going to be able to get out of that pit that they've dug themselves. Because I think, and this is totally subjective, this is totally me kind of flying by the seat of my pants, for some odd reason, I think there's something that Marvel has captured in the fans to make them loyal to the brand and to the characters more than anything DC can do or has done. Yep. Right? You look at Spider-Man, X-Men, those books, regardless of critical acclaim, are always selling big numbers. I mean, even Marvel's sort of half-assed attempts before they got the film rights back to reboot X-Men every single time sold buku bucks. DC, Batman. Maybe that's it. And even then, the last major Batman run towards the tail end was selling somewhere between what? 50 and 65,000 copies? That's half of the index. Batman is literally the index that all of the sales figures go by. A 1 index rating is 100,000 copies, which is set by Batman. And it was selling lower than its own index by almost half. So I don't know. I guess that could be a conversation for another time, is like discussing the sort of varying brand loyalties, but without that level of commitment that Marvel seems to have with their readership, I think it does spell, I don't want to say total disaster because things are cyclical, and I think and I hope that DC will bounce back, but it doesn't say anything good for them in the immediate future.
Yeah, the problem is what you're seeing now. Remember the lead time to create comics. So what you're all seeing now, you know, Future State and even to some extent the monthly books that came out before, and maybe, I mean, I don't know how much Marie Javins was involved with Infinite Frontier the first few months. What we're getting right now, the content that's coming out from DC Comics right now, is when they had no captain. It was a rudderless ship. So yeah, when people say it seems like DC has no plan, they had no plan. They had nobody calling the shots. Nobody running the show on a day-to-day basis. And my understanding is there were days where editorial was like, as an editor, I don't even know I don't know who my boss is. Do I go ask Pamela Leifer? Do I ask Jim Lee? Do I ask Marie Javins? Do I ask Michelle? Like, I don't know who I'm answering to at this point. I have creators coming to me asking me questions that I don't know what to tell them. So we're in this sort of rut right now. We just need to get over it, and then we'll see. I don't think we'll know until like late May, early June. I don't think we can say definitively that, okay, the quality of DC Comics going forward is going to be this, until we get a chance to see what kind of editor-in-chief is Marie Javins going to be. Because we all know that Bob Harris was editor-in-chief in name and handling more of the kind of the nuts and bolts kind of thing. But really, Dan Didio, even though he got the promotion from executive editor, which was basically editor-in-chief, to publisher, he never stopped really being the editor-in-chief.
Right.
And so, you know, I see Tevye, he just really despises Dan from everything I could see.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up too.
But no, this is actually not Didio's fault. This is the product of them firing Dan Didio.
Right.
And Dan himself said it was probably time for him to go, not because he didn't want to do it anymore, and not because he didn't think he could do it anymore, because he felt like he was starting to repeat himself. He was starting to do things that he had done. He'd been there for a long time. So it's probably it was probably time, this is Dan's own words, probably time for someone else to come in and shake things up and you know, get somebody with some new ideas and some fresh blood in there. That's Dan saying it. But here's the thing about Dan. He kept the trains running on time. He kept people excited. Maybe he was too hands-on at times and, you know, was ruling with a little too much of an iron fist. But he loved comics, and, you know, whether you agreed with the creative decisions he made or not, he cared about the fans. He cared about DC Comics. And we just had this long period of time, far too long. I mean, you want to talk about having no plan. They fired Dan and didn't know what they were going to do. That's the problem. You know, they just let the ship just steer itself. And the quality of the books that are coming out now, this is the consequence of them not thinking forward, you know? And in terms of, hey, well, can DC right the ship? It all comes down to one word that I will give you: patience. If Pamela Lyford and the powers that be at AT&T can have some patience and let the people, whether you agree with Marie Javin's editorial style or the work that she's done, you know, working with creative teams over the past few years or not, the woman knows comics. Mm-hmm. And she's beloved by her creators. She knows what she's doing. So whether or not you aesthetically agree with the tone or not, like, forget about that, because there's going to be enough people that will.
Yep.
If you give her time to do things the way she knows they should be done, and you can be patient, you can exercise some patience, DC will be back. We'll get good DC content. If, like any corporate entities, if they're going to be knee-jerk, then you're going to have problems. Again, it all goes back to the fact there's lead time. It takes time to plan and then execute. And then even once you've executed on the back end, it takes 2 months to actually see it on the stands. So you got to give her like 6 months, you know? And that's why I'm saying at the earliest, late May, early July, or June rather, late May, early June. Let's see what the books look like then. We'll have a better idea. What do the solicits look like? What books are actually coming out? What creators are there? And what's the quality of the books? So we all have to have a little bit of patience. And I'm not saying that means you need to be going out and giving them money right now. If it's crap, it's crap. Yeah. Check back in April or May. You know, pick up a book, flip through it, check the news sites, come and watch Dark Knight's channel, listen to my podcast. We'll tell you if things are getting better or not.
Yes, we will. That's for sure. And so I kind of want to attack this in two things. I want to obviously approach what Tevye just said. I have one question for you. Can you blame Dan DiDio for ruining everything when you don't like what DC's doing right now, and he hasn't been with DC for over half a year?
Almost a year.
Yeah. Is
this been a year?
March?
It was before. I saw him in January last year. That was the last show that he did as publisher. I'm just going to Google Didio fired really quick right here. Okay, February 26th says last Friday. So yeah, so basically the last couple weeks of February. So we're 11 months out.
Right. So a year, even better. This proves my point even better. Can you blame DC for the current state of DC Comics when he hasn't worked for DC in a year? Right?
No, you can't.
You know, like that's the thing that's always sort of bothered me, because whether or not you agree with Dan DiDio, because I didn't most of the time, he's not the scapegoat. He simply cannot be the scapegoat for everything that is wrong with DC Comics at the current moment. You know, and I do honestly feel bad for the guy, because he was passionate. He did care about everything he did. Was everything he did a bullseye? Absolutely not. No. But I do get a little bit exhausted seeing Dan DiDio the constant scapegoat for all of DC's creative troubles. Was he the guy to hire Bendis and to give Bendis creative control? Yes. Yes, he was. Was it a huge mistake? Absolutely it was. Did he also I mean, to be fair, I think the mid 2000s and Rebirth were two of the best eras DC Comics have ever seen in the history of the 80 plus year company. So
I don't know. So I it's so interesting. I get it. Like, yeah, was it Dan? Was Dan had been reaching out to Bendis for years, for years. Hey, come over, come over, come over, come over. And then Bendis finally says, okay, maybe it is time. And he comes over. I mean, somebody way higher than Dan's pay grade signed off on that exclusive contract.
right.
You know, whether you want to talk about, well, were paying Bendis so much money he couldn't do all these other things. But here's the thing: like, I can't blame Dan for taking a shot because Bendis, you know, was a big name for the longest period of time. But you know who I blame for Bendis's crap being crap? I blame Bendis. You want to talk about, like, his stuff is garbage, and he's the one writing it. So yeah, do I wish Dan hadn't taken a chance on him, brought him over? Yes, 100%. But I don't blame Dan for taking the shot. And here's the other thing: like, if you've ever had a chance to meet Dan, and some of the editorial decisions and the things that were made, they were things that he didn't even necessarily agree with himself, but he was always the one to stand up and take the bullet for it because he saw that as his job. And there were things that came down from on high at Warner Brothers because of movie things, because of TV things, where they said, well, we need to go in this direction, or we need, you know, for the most part, they were hands off, certainly not involved the way AT&T and Lyford are. But you can't give Dan credit for those errors. Like, you can't give him all the credit for those errors that were great, but you also can't give him the blame for things like, oh, they decided to kill Wally West, or Doomsday Clock was late, you know, or Rebirth didn't keep up momentum, or New 52 didn't keep up momentum. Does he share some of the blame? 100%, and he'd be the first to tell you that. But I think he gets blamed for too much that went wrong, and he doesn't really get much credit for what went right, which is fine because it's a team, and that's what you have to. And he always took that, you know. He's the first one to say, felt like I was the face of the publishing company, and that was my job, was to take the heat. So if anything went wrong, doesn't matter whose fault it was my fault. You got to respect the guy for that.
And he was willing to often, I mean, it does seem that he was willing to fall on his sword eventually. You know, even, you know, there were a good handful of big name creators that were less than satisfied with their interaction with DiDio. Well, guess what? About half of them, at some point in time, he was able to convince to come back. Grant Morrison, Greg Rucka, both of them at some point in time had sworn off DC Comics as long as Dan DiDio was there. What did he do? He got him back. So you got to give the guy credit, you know.
And again, yeah, he's the first to admit that at times he especially early on. Because here's the thing: Dan didn't come up in comics; he came up in animation. So there was always he always felt like somewhat of an outsider.
And soap operas.
Yeah, soap operas. You're right. And so, and he, you know, he's gone on record as saying this before. Yeah, there were times where he kind of felt he had to, for lack of a better term, establish his dominance, and he maybe did it in the wrong way. But he was always the person to fully take responsibility and go back to those creators and say, you know what, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. And when my understanding from last time I talked to Dan, everybody that he ever worked with at DC, he's on good terms with, from Rucka to Mark Waid to Grant Morrison, everybody. So I don't think there's any problems there.
It's just so odd to get a finger on the pulse here, you know, with what's happening. And I guess that's kind of what we're going to attempt to do, is to sort of speculate as to what we think, you know, coming at, based on what we're hearing about Infinite Frontier, based on what we're seeing from Future State. You know, I think it'd be interesting to kind of give an idea as to where we think DC might be going, maybe over the next year, next 2 years. I mean, obviously we know they're going to be focusing on story over continuity, but they're also seeming like they're interested in doing these big sort of office level publishing initiatives. I mean, they're doing big things in the space of Gotham within the pages of Batman, supposedly. Same thing with Superman and all of the House of L. And yet we're not stressing continuity, even though these projects seem to be pretty continuity heavy. So does that mean that these things will have their own separate continuity of sorts? What happens, you know? And I think one thing that sort of worries me is that it seems like we're very often sort of treading old water that we've quite frankly done better before. We've talked about this with a couple of the future state books on your podcast, which everybody should go listen to, link in the description below. A lot of these future state stories are things that we've seen, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and all of them to much better degrees. So is that what Infinite Frontier has in store for us? Are we going to see recycled stories because now everything and nothing matters? It's so hard to tell. Jace, I know it puts you in a difficult situation, but based on what we're hearing, based on what we're reading from Future State, what does the sort of immediate future of Infinite Frontier look like to you from this far in advance?
Yeah. So again, it's going to be a rough ride when it starts off, because back to my earlier point where you have creators that not only are they sort of behind the 8 ball with the sort of critical reception of Future State, and so people are already expecting it to be bad. I mean, I haven't heard that many people praising Future State. I certainly haven't heard DC fans being happy. DC fans seem to be vocally unhappy right now. So people are going in with this sort of prejudiced view that this stuff's going to be bad, right? Again, I fully blame DC for shooting themselves in the foot for not having a plan. It's
Right.
their own fault. They fired Didio. They didn't have a plan, and they just let it perpetuate. They couldn't.
And real quick, while you're talking about like the lack of plan, one thing I did want to mention is that even Infinite Frontier, they started pitching it in September, pitching it, not developing it, pitching it. They had 3 months of a complete production halt or a distribution halt to pivot and find a direction that would work best for them based on where they are now. Future State is a bit of an indicator of them obviously trying to recycle some old stuff, throw in some new stuff. But let that be said, is that
what they did in those 3 months? They worked on the books that were already monthly books, and okay, this is the stuff that was already planned, and then we were going to get to 5G. So stick a pin in where 5G was going to be, and we'll get to what happens then. Let's just concentrate on the books that need to come out between now and then, and also we got to work on fandom. That's what they did. That's what they spent their time on, which that's great. Fandom, I think, was a big success and got a lot of people excited. And from AT&T's perspective, yeah, they're going to want to push the multimedia stuff, the TV and the movies, because that makes way more money than comics. So I get it. But yeah, finally, early September, Marie Javins, okay, she's our editor-in-chief. We did think we were going to get co-editors-in-chief with her and Michelle Wells, but for whatever reason, it's just Marie. Great, she knows comics. Okay, now let's start thinking up a plan. What are we going to do? Okay, Infinite Frontier, what does that mean? So you're talking late October before you actually start getting creative teams together, because I'm sure it took at least a couple months to, get everything together. So yeah, you just don't know. So it's just, they're in a really tough position because people are going to go into Infinite Frontier expecting it to suck, especially because we're seeing a lot of the same names, like a Tim Sheridan, like a Jeffrey Thorne, and all that kind of thing. So if it were a situation where you're talking about creators who you hear me say it over and over on our Future State Fridays, this looks rushed, both in terms of narrative, plot, pacing, especially artwork. This looks rushed. So it's one thing if a book is bad because it was rushed in the production, in putting the book together. But it's a creator who has experience creating comics, and once they have time, a normal timeline, you'll get a quality book. That's not the situation here when you talk about people like a Tim Sheridan or some of these others where, and man, I feel bad for Tim. We keep throwing his name out there. It's because it just, man, his books weren't that good, and it's the name that sticks in my head. There's others too. It's not just him. So when you start talking about, okay, can they right the ship? Well, it's not just a matter of them not being rushed. They've also got to learn the intricacies and the kind of the things that are unique to creating a comic, the way the creative process happens. So do I expect Infinite Frontier to be great right from the start? No. Does it mean that you shouldn't read any of it? Well, that's an individual choice that you have to make. I mean, I'm still going to pick up the titles that I'm going to pick up. I will say that after talking to Philip Kennedy Johnson yesterday, I feel a lot better about his Superman titles. Do I feel like he's retreading things a little bit? Yeah, we've had Mongol stories before. We've had War World stories before. But the sense that I got from talking to Philip is how much he loves Superman.
Yeah.
And so, I'm going to give it a try. Do I think he was the best choice? No, I don't. The thing I keep going back to Philip with is how great he is at building world building. It's his stock and trade. He's so good at it. Maybe one of the best working in comics today. You know what? Guess what? Superman doesn't need to have a world built.
Right.
It's there already. So I kind of, but he loves Superman and he's going to do his best. And maybe it'll turn out to be great. Maybe not. But I think it'll still be better than what Bendis was doing based on our conversation. It was a really great conversation. We didn't just talk about Superman. We also talked about some of his other work. Kill a Man, which is the original graphic novel he did for Aftershock with Steve Orlando, which was spectacular. If you guys didn't read it. So we talked about some of his other stuff. He has Aliens coming up from Marvel as well. Mm-hmm. So I want to get us, and we talked in general about a lot of the things that Trevor and I are talking about here. How do the creators feel? What's the sense of things going forward? So I highly recommend it if you're curious about the future of DC and also how this Future State thing happened to go and listen to that interview. So what I expect from Future State is I really expect it to be better, or Infinite Frontier. What I expect from Infinite Frontier is overall, I expect it to be better than Future State, but I still expect it to be really uneven to start. And then as things move along, as people start both getting more comfortable and familiar with the creative process and what needs to happen, and you start seeing some other veteran creators that are right now, as we're recording this, that are right now pitching things. Because again, for the last few months, it was all about, okay, let's pitch Infinite Frontier. Let's figure out what it is. Let's get the creative teams. Now it's the holidays and we're all out of the office. I mean, they're out of the office anyway, but they're not even working. So now New Year comes. Now you're getting the creators that you know and love from DC, like a Jurgens or a Venditti or a Tomasi or whoever. They're pitching their stuff now. Yeah. So when you start talking about when you might see some of those other books, and I think it's going to be a lot of where, you know what, okay, we're going to decide that if Tomasi wants to do something or Venditti wants to do something, let's do it as a digital only. Because from AT&T's perspective, you don't have to pay for shipping, you don't have to pay for printing. It's much more, of a profit margin for them. And if it does, if it is really successful, we can switch it over to print. We can print hardcovers. We can do different things. We'll throw it in an anthology. We'll do something different. You're just going to see a lot more of that coming from DC. So again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I expect Infinite Frontier to be very uneven to start, but it's so hard to say what I think the future of DC will look like until we get to the summer, basically, when we start seeing, okay, now this is familiar. Now this is a Robert Venditti book. Of course I'm going to pick it up. Now, Eddie Barrows is working on this with Peter J. Tomasi. I know that's going to be a great title, So until we get there, it's going to be hard to say. I'm optimistic based on the fact that the changes that DC have made that are going to have the most lasting impact, even though as fans, it's going to take an adjustment period, this fact that there's not tight continuity and you can just tell whatever story you want to tell. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk about why am I going to go back to DC and work at a lower page rate? Well, it's because now, both from a practical standpoint, they don't have as many editors, so that you don't have somebody looking over your shoulder, but also you don't have to worry about going back and keeping track of this or that or whatever. You just tell the best story you can, right? The reins are loosened. And so you can pitch a story like, I'm going to tell a Blue Devil story that's set in the Old West, or I'm going to tell a Green Lantern story with Hal Jordan where, he goes on a murderous rampage or whatever, right? And well, no, because Hal Jordan's over here in the Justice League book, you can't do that. There's going to be none of that. If it's a good story and they like the pitch, hey, tell your story. So I think overall, assuming that they can weather this storm that they're going through and AT&T can have a little patience, that eventually you'll see, by the end of the year, you'll see an upswing. That's what I'm keeping my fingers crossed for, basically. Mm-hmm. But really, until this pandemic ends and these lockdowns end, everything is still so up in the air because there's no conventions. There's no kind of the regular sort of environment that fosters really good collaboration or whatever. I mean, people think of conventions. Okay, well, that's just a place where people go and they spend money and they attend some panels and they take a photo op or get a signature autograph or what have you. Man, especially San Diego, New York, San Diego especially, it is all about, you go to San Diego not to show up and do a signing. You go to San Diego because that's the one time a year you see your editor or your publisher face to face. And there's all these meetings and summits and things that take place that aren't taking place now, or they're taking. I can't remember who it was that I talked to. Somebody from the X-Men team, might have been Vita Ayala. Oh no, you know who it was? It was Ed Brisson. It was Ed Brisson. When I talked to him, and he was like, I asked him specifically, how have the summits been that you've been doing them virtually? He's like, they're good and it's great to see everybody, but you just don't have the same energy that you have when you got everybody in the same place, in the same room, throwing out ideas and feeding off each other. So, unfortunately, we're still in the midst of this thing, and it's hard to say. I do think things will improve with Infinite Frontier. And I hope that Lyford has some patience. She's able to fight off the dogs at her door that she has to deal with, the money handlers at AT&T. So I hope she can fight them off and give Marie Javins the time to do what she needs to do, because I think they can come back from this. So I just expect that it's going to be wildly uneven. I think there will be some good titles in Infinite Frontier, and I think there'll be some real dogs. And it could even flip, like things that we thought were great in Future State or pretty good may turn out to be crap. And things like Tim Sheridan's Teen Titans could be the best title. I mean, we have no idea. It's a total crapshoot. I mean, I expect the things that were good before to be good, like Ram V's Catwoman. I expect that to be good. Tynan's Batman, if you liked it before, you'll like it now. I know some people have problems with it. I think it's okay, not great. Nowhere near as good as his indie stuff that he's doing. So I expect Jeffrey Thorne's Green Lantern not to be very good. I expect Bendis's Justice League to be only worth papering the bottom of a birdcage. So, there's something that we can probably say to a certainty that, they're not going to be very good. And there's other things that, it's still up in the air. Like Harley Quinn is a perfect example. Harley Quinn with Stephanie Phillips, who I think is an up and coming writer, very talented. Does she have a real feel for who Harley is in present continuity? And if you like Harley, can you stand Riley Rossmo's art enough to pick it up on a regular basis? I don't like Harley, so it's no skin off my nose. But man, if I loved Harley and I know Stephanie and she's a friend and I love her work, I'm glad I don't have a dilemma. I'm glad, like if Stephanie was on Superman and Riley was, oh my God, if they were on Action, which I have a huge Action run, it's the one comic I'll always buy. I would buy Action and I would put it in a bag and put it in my box, and I wouldn't even it's just, here we go. Here's issue 1100. Stick it in don't even read it, because his art. The Legion book that came out this last week. It's one of the worst comics I've ever read in my life.
Yeah, not surprised. I'm totally not surprised.
You didn't even read it, right? You glanced at it.
I refuse to read it. I have dipped my toes into books that I was less than optimistic about, in order to just do my due diligence for our Feature State Fridays, but I can't. I won't.
And when you told me you weren't going to read it, I'm like, that's perfectly fine. I would never subject anybody to that comic at all.
Yeah,
at all.
100%. Real quick, Aaron wants to know, Jace, and I know the answer to this question, but is your podcast available on Spotify? Yeah,
my podcast is available anywhere podcasts are: iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play. The one place I'm not sure that we're on is there's some kind of podcast network for Teslas, for the cars. I'm not sure if we're on that, but other than that, we're everywhere, man. iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher. Yeah, we're everywhere. So yeah.
Spotify is where I listen. So I knew the answer to that question immediately. So the problem is obviously, my bread and butter is kind of being like the critical guy, the one that's going to kind of try to see through the grandeur and what everybody's saying to what I feel like they're going to be doing. And to a degree, I very much do agree with you, Jace. I do think that best case scenario, we have a rough couple of months and then those sort of mid-tier writers come back, they do their thing. And if all goes well, best case scenario, they are now able to tell those stories that they were pigeonholed away from these last couple years, where DC was having issues balancing the Tom Kingdom and the Bendis, the Bendis barrier and the Scott Snyder universe. Like, hopefully this is an environment where those sort of quote unquote, again, mid-tier writers are able to tell those stories, because I tend to prefer those writers that have less clout and more talent, but that's just me. It's so hard for me to be optimistic based on me seeing a lot of their bigger names starting to hurt away. To the quality of the books thus far, I've been pleasantly surprised by, Catwoman and the Yara Flor Wonder Woman, and of course, so far Mariko Tamaki's Dark Detective. There have also been books that I've been disappointed by. I was actually just reading Imperious Lex today.
Yeah. Did you read Aquaman yet?
Not yet. I'm looking forward to it though.
I really enjoyed Aquaman, and there's no Aquaman title yet announced in March or April.
Well, right. Well, because they had to get all of their, I'm sorry, not all of them, half of their Batman titles solicited. And that is, when you were talking about, this Killer Green Lantern story and Blue Devil in the West, replace all those with Batman. That's what it's starting to feel like. And obviously my channel is named DarkKnightNation. I love Batman. He's my favorite character in all of fiction, bar none. Does it get annoying oversaturating the market? Yes. I'm slightly more favorable to seeing Bat titles right now, strictly because I'm not enjoying the mainline Bat series, so I need my fix. And considering I've been unsatisfied with the Batman title for the better part of the last 3 to 4 years, yeah, I feel like I deserve some good Bat books. But when you're letting everybody do Batman because that name will sell, that's where we get on some pretty shaky legs. And what I am afraid is these brilliant creators coming to DC with these inventive ideas that are going to sort of break the boundaries of traditional superhero comics. And I feel like DC is going to say, sounds great. Can you put Batman, Joker, and or Harley Quinn in those books instead? And that's really what scares me, amongst a couple of other things. I also did, before I forget, I did want to give a quick shout out to Aaron VO, just for contributing to the channel here with a tip, just saying, glad to see you getting back into the rhythm, brother. Thank you, man. I'm glad to be back in some sort of a rhythm. Hopefully I can maintain it, but thank you guys for showing up and supporting the channel. It definitely incentivizes me remaining in said rhythm. So in terms of what I'm thinking DC Future State is going to be looking like, it's hard to tell. Unfortunately, just knowing myself and just not wanting to lie to you guys, I'm not optimistic for the near future of DC Comics. I'm not optimistic for DC a year from now, and I'm not overly optimistic 2 years from now. They are very much flying by the seat of their pants, and they're not taking a step back and trying to understand what has made them successful in the last couple years. And I don't think they're interested in critical success. Actually, I know they're not interested in critical success unless it equates to monetary success. It is so. Only time will tell. And to be fair, I will continue to give very honest thoughts on what's happening in DC. Like I said, there have been books that I've been pleasantly surprised by, and I have been happy to scream from the rooftops the names of the books that I've actually been enjoying, over the last couple months at DC, because they are far and few between. So while I do admit to going into the sort of near future of DC Comics with a sort of less than optimistic mindset, I promise I will not totally be deferred from admitting when I feel like something is just sheerly good. And I would love, and I've been saying this about DC for years, which kind of hurts. I would love to be proven wrong. I would absolutely love for DC to turn around and put out the next great thing, right, as a whole line. And I'm sure there will be a sprinkling of a handful of books that I do enjoy from DC Comics, although a handful might even be highballing it at this point. But it's just hard to tell. It's hard for me to be optimistic, even with these sort of potential plus sides to the infinite nature of Infinite Frontier and the possibilities. It just feels to me like they're leaving themselves more room to confuse the reader, to confuse the writers, to confuse the artists, and to not establish any sort of stability, narratively or in the continuity or what have you. So it's so hard to tell. And I'm becoming very disenfranchised with listening to creators sort of pitch their future for their space in DC, because listen, I listen to interviews with James Tynion now. I listened to interviews with James Tynion a couple months ago, and what he has to say about what he wants to do in Gotham sounds wonderful. It sounds like a direction that I would want DC to take Batman in. Did I drop Tynion's Batman 2 months ago? I absolutely did. Do I plan on going back to Tynion's Batman? I absolutely do not. So even though it sounds wonderful on paper, the execution is a total another story. And I think that's why I'm still reluctant, even if a creator sounds like they have a real idea of where their footing lies. So I don't know. It just being completely honest and unabashed about it. I am not looking forward to DC over the next couple months. I would love to be surprised. I would love for some of these no-name writers to make a name for themselves, because I can relate to that. That's the position that I am in. And I will even cite that as a bias. In fact, I want these no names to kick some ass and take some names and to make it, I've been saying for months, Jace can hold me accountable to it. I kept saying DC needs fresh voices. DC needs new people to shock the system. And I feel like DC kind of half listened, to be honest with you. They got new people, but by new, they meant real new. Not just new to DC Comics, but new to comics in general. And while that's not always bad, I am and have been seeing traits in the writing of recent DC books that are not only indicative of a lack of knowledge in the format, but a lack of knowledge in narrative storytelling as a whole, regardless of format. There are certain things that should bleed over into comics work. There are certain things that you can identify as a lack of an understanding, as a lack of an understanding with the format. But that's not really the case here. In fact, I find it ironic because most of the time, I talk about pacing, for example, being one of the first things to fall by the wayside when a creator approaches.
Hardest thing to get right, especially if you're new.
Right. And so far pacing's been pretty okay. It's everything else that seems to be falling down. So, and even artists, like you were saying, even artists have just not been bringing it home. To be quite frank, spoiler for something I'll say in Future State Friday over on the Comic Source this weekend. The art in the Red Hood backup is some of the worst comic book art I've seen in the big two in years. It looked like Doug meets Red Hood. You know that old 90s Nickelodeon cartoon, Doug? Yep. It's Doug meets Red Hood. I'm telling you. Rose Wilson looked like Patty Mayonnaise with a silver wig. Okay. Yep. And I don't mean that in a good way. not so, and not in a positively nostalgic way. So it's it's just rough. With all that being said, again, I would love for DC to flip the tide, put out a couple of books, get a finger on what the new pulse is of the industry and where they can succeed both financially and critically. Because I feel like, and I've said this many times, there is a much more productive outlook when you sacrifice immediate sales for critical success, because the sales 9 times out of 10 will come. And there are occasions where you have diamonds that will go totally unrecognized in the market, but it's very rare. And to be quite frank, they'll usually come back on the trade market. And I brought this example up before. Look at Tom King's Omega Men, DC's lowest selling book at the time. There were books that were selling better than Omega Men that were getting canceled before Omega Men was. in trade sales, Omega Men's doing money fairly consistently. And you see that time and time again. So, I'm hoping DC recognizes that. I'm hoping that the fact that AT&T is hemorrhaging out onto the side of the streets doesn't continue to make DC, fly by the seat of their pants, because I think it's sort of brought them nothing but disjunction and chaos. But here we are. If you want to get a sort of in-depth idea of how I've been feeling about a couple of these DC Future State books, I've done a couple reviews on the channel for the next Batman issues 1 and 2, Dark Detective issues 1 and 2. I'm hoping to churn out a Catwoman review this week as well. And if you want to see a little bit more of a wider glance of DC Future State as a whole, again, you can catch me, Jace, and my normal partner in crime, Comic Boom, over on Jace's podcast, The Comic Source, where we do these Future State Fridays every week for you guys, going over the full gambit, unabashed thoughts and opinions from all of us. And I see Mark McKeever saying he picked up the first 3 issues of Crossover on my suggestion. So good. I'm glad you're enjoying it, man. I've been having a good time with that one. And I do recommend, for those of you that have come here as a viewer who are strictly big 2 superhero comics, consider branching out into indie, because that's where it's at. There are a lot of big publishers, big and small, really hitting the ground running with great concepts. Whether you want something like Crossover that is an homage to the industry, to superhero comics, or you want to go into something that feels more like a genre story, they're out there, and they've been great. For as hard as I've been on James Tynion's Batman, I've been really enjoying the stuff he's been doing out in indie. And I never thought I would say that, because 3 years ago, if you had told me that I was reading just as much, if not more, indie than DC and Marvel, I would tell you you're absolutely crazy. So consider giving those books a look. As we're closing out, Jace, let the folks know what you have coming up. Where, obviously, you kind of brought it up earlier, but just remind them, where can they find you? And, both for the podcast and on social media.
Yeah, so I would just echo what Knight was saying. One thing I didn't mention, like, this whole future state thing, in the end, it doesn't matter, because we're not going to ever come back to these stories in these time periods. So take a break from DC for now and go hunt up Gideon Falls or Crossover or Commanders in Crisis or Red Atlantis. I mean, there's so many great indie titles that are out there right now. So give some other stuff a try. Obviously, Area 51, the Helix Project, is another great book, and there's tons of great indie out there. So it's not like we're stuck for lack of quality stories. As far as what I have coming up, look for the conversation with Chris Arent. If you want a real nuts and bolts kind of look behind the curtain at the comic industry and the impact of the pandemic for 2020, what that looks like in terms of retailers. We talk a lot about the new distributors, talk about what the book market, talk about what's to come in 2020. And then Chris and I give a sense of what we've been hearing from creators and editors that we've talked to. So it's a real behind the curtain kind of look at what we expect and what changes you might see in 2021 going forward. On Sunday, for our Superman Sunday episode, is that conversation with Philip Kennedy Johnson about Superman, as well as some of his other work, Last God and Aliens, that's upcoming, and the Kill a Man title from a graphic novel from Aftershock. Beyond that, I've got a lot of other interviews. I'm so busy with interviews. People are reaching out left and right. I'm having to push people off for weeks right now, going, man, I just don't have the time. Everybody's kind of gearing up. Like, we got a new president, and people are ready to start with the creator own. A lot of Kickstarters, spotlights coming up that people want to come on and talk about. I have an interview coming up soon with Ryan Parrott about his Aftershock book. Steve Orlando's got another Aftershock book coming out. He's going to be coming on the show soon. So be sure you're following me on Twitter's where I'm most active, or Instagram. Just do a search for The Comic Source on either of those, and you'll find me. Very active on those platforms. Love answering questions. People ask me stuff all the time, like, "Oh, I loved Red Hood and Dark Detective. When are we going to get more of that story?" And oftentimes I'll tag the creator as well, and then they'll jump in the conversation. So now you're being able to interact with the creator as well. So but I put it out all over on social media whenever we have new new episodes coming out and what they're about. So we don't expect you to listen to everything because sometimes it's 8 or 10 episodes a week. So, join in for what you like, whether that's Aftershock or Marvel Mondays or Friday Spotlights, which tend to be DC, or whether it's Kickstarter stuff. There's something for everybody. Just do a search for the Comic Source on Google or whatever social media, and you'll find us. I know a lot of people use the podcast apps these days, Podcatcher or what have you. Do a search for the Comic Source on there. You'll find me. I'm always at the top of the search list. Wasn't always the case when I started off. The only reason my personal website is not thecomicsource.com is because there's some store in Florida back in the 90s that owns that, and I didn't want to pay them through the nose for it. But they used to show up first when you search, but now they're way, way down at the bottom.
You did it.
Yeah,
the ultimate sign of success.
Yeah, always appreciate the support, and yeah, thanks for having me on as always, Trevor.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Make sure you guys go check out Jace and the Comic Source podcast. And I do want to plug this awesome interview that he actually had with Kyle Higgins. I know Jace has sold it pretty well on one of our last couple streams. Obviously convinced Mark McKeever to pick up the Radiant Black title, convinced me to pick up the Radiant Black title as well. And that's saying something because I am the first person to totally disown a superhero comic that is reminiscent of a superhero that already exists. So the fact that he's convinced me to take a choice when I'm not taking a chance on most of my favorite DC Comics superheroes, that says something. So go check out that interview. It's a good one amongst many others. And you'll occasionally hear me just screaming and hollering on the podcast as well. Of course, if you are new to the channel, make sure that you are subscribed for more content like this, as well as very, very in-depth analytical reviews of current comic books. And we're kind of thinking about stretching out into retro reviews or retro analysis, kind of trying to gauge what was so successful about these evergreen stories, from art to writing to even the design work. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know down in the comments as well. Big thank you to everybody for watching. If you haven't already, please consider checking out my comic book, Area 51, The Helix Project. There is a very, very, very low margin of entry. If you would just like a digital copy to read at home, it's available as a super high definition PDF that you can download onto your computer, or on Comixology if you want that sweet, sweet guided view. And if you do happen to pick it up there, please leave me a 5-star review if you end up enjoying the book. Otherwise, the book is made on super high quality premium stock, very thick, very durable, and I think that the contents inside will leave you happy. If you want to get an idea of what the story is about before you commit to buying it, click the link in my description below, DarkKnightNation.com/shop. There's a little write-up for the story with a couple of preview art pages. So thank you guys again so much. If you haven't already, go check out Jace on Twitter at The Comic Source, myself at DarkKnightNat25, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Let's Talk Comics. Thanks for stopping by.
Take care, guys.